Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and I know I always say this, but this week's guest is so exciting, and I have been after him for over a year, haven't I, Tom?
Yes, James, you've been pursuing me very, very hard, and I've been very evasive, and now you've cornered me.
In France. I had to come to France to track you down.
Yes.
Yeah. My special guest this week is none other than the brilliant historian, Tom Holland, author of books that I haven't written down. So, Tom, just tell me a few.
They've obviously had a massive impact on you.
No, I have read them. I've read your books. I've read some of them.
Rubicon,
yeah,
about the fall of the Roman Republic. Persian Fire, about the Persian Wars. Marathon, Thermopylae, Salamis, that lot. Millennium, which is about Western Europe in the 10th and 11th centuries. In the Shadow of the Sword, which is about late antiquity and the emergence of Islam. Dynasty, which is the sequel to Rubicon and tells the story of the Julio-Claudians, so all the Caligula and Nero and all that crew. And then a very short biography of Aethelstan, the first king of England. And forthcoming Ladybird biography of Aethelflaed, Aethelstan's aunt, the daughter of Alfred the Great, the founding mother of England.
Oh, do you know, I've barely heard of her. Just briefly tell me why we should care about her.
Okay, well, she died 1100 years ago this year, and she's probably the most significant political figure in English history that no one has heard of. She's certainly the most significant female political figure in English history, and probably without her, the United Kingdom of England might very well not exist.
Whoa. You'd have thought the feminists would have reclaimed her earlier.
Well, not just feminists. I mean, I think everyone in English, she's an amazingly heroic figure. She was married off by Alfred, who was the King of Wessex in the south of what would become England, to the leading man in Mercia, which is basically the Midlands. And there was a profound ambivalence about this guy's role. Was he a king or was he just the leading nobleman? And Aethelflaed was married to him. He died. Aethelflaed took over his title. He'd been Lord of the Mercians, so she became Lady of the Mercians. And she again ruled in a kind of ambivalent relationship with her brother, so Alfred's son, Edward, who ruled as the King of Wessex. But Aethelflaed essentially was the ruler of the Midlands, of Mercia. She was a great warrior queen, so she led the attack against the Danelaw, which ended up with everywhere south of the Humber being absorbed into the nascent kingdom of England. But she was also a great sponsor of towns, of markets, of churches, and really, with her brother, is one of the great founders of English urbanism. So Wolverhampton is the creation of Aethelflaed.
I hadn't even expected to talk even once about Aethelflaed, so thank you for that nice digression. She sounds amazing.
She was a clearly remarkable woman. We know really almost everything that we know about her derives from very, very scanty sources, from charters, from coins. But the evidence that we have points to her being a really, really remarkable figure. And so I'm very happy that readers of Ladybird books will get the chance to know more about her.
Yeah. So what were the battles she was fighting in? I mean, were there any significant battles in...
Well, the single best battle, she refounded Chester, which had been a Roman town, but had been given over to weeds and nettles and rubble, and various Viking warbands would camp out in it. And because Chester provided control over the Mersey, and the Mersey was the route of passage between the Viking capital in Dublin and the Viking capital in York, by refounding Chester, she was essentially able to throttle that access link. And so the Vikings were pissed off about this, understandably. And according to later stories, they laid siege to Chester, and the defenders of Chester saw the Vikings off by boiling up beer and tipping it on the Vikings, and even better, by toppling beehives on top of them. And so all the bee, and this kind of wonderful description, the Vikings were put to flight by virtue of the bees thereof, which is it's kind of a fantastic line. And my single most prized possession is a coin that was minted in Chester in Aethelflaed's lifetime, and it shows this tower which could either be the symbol of a church or of a kind of bulwark of a gate, may well deliberately be both, but it's absolutely representative of everything that she was. That she was a great military leader, she was a great sponsor of Christian values, of market towns, of essentially of civilization. The culture of a city. And this is her great bequest to what becomes Anglo-Saxon England and then the Kingdom of England.
I'd forgotten you were a numismatist. What's your Aethelflaed coin worth?
I put in a bid for it in an auction. There are very few of these coins
that's high level
left.
collecting.
And I have a friend who is a very expert numismatist who managed to snaffle it for me. It's over £10,000.
Oh my!
It's over £10,000.
Tom,
But essentially, this is England's equivalent of the Declaration of Independence. If England has a kind of founding image, this is what it is. And so, what a wonderful thing to have.
Yeah. Did you expect you were going to become an historian? Was that always the plan?
No, I wanted to be a great writer. I wanted to be a great novelist, and it gradually dawned on me, writing several novels, that I wasn't destined to be a great novelist.
Wrote some novels?
I wrote a kind of what I hoped would be a great novel. It turned out not to be, and as a way of keeping the wolf from the door, I wrote a novel in which Lord Byron was a vampire. This was about the same time as the film of Interview with the Vampire, which I think is the only film in which Tom Cruise is a blonde. And the premise is that Byron actually was a vampire, because he took part in the Mary Shelley Frankenstein generating evening, and he told a story about an English lord who became a vampire. And it kind of did well enough that I was able to keep my head above water. But it was an exercise. I wrote kind of 4 vampire novels, so all genre fiction. And the great thing about genre fiction is that as a novelist, it gives you rules. And vampire fiction in particular, you have to establish the frameworks by which your vampires, flourish. And in a sense, that was excellent training for writing what I gradually discovered I was really interested in, which was history, because all the vampire stories were set in various periods of history. And the last one I wrote was set in Egypt, and it was kind of constructed like a Russian doll. So the inner story was the story of Tutankhamun, then we had a Fatimid caliph in the 10th century, and then we had the story of Howard Carter discovering Tutankhamun's tomb. And I went to enormous lengths, enormous amounts of research, conclusively to demonstrate that Tutankhamun and Akhenaten, probably his father, had been vampires. And I thought, this is going to set the world of Egyptology on its head. And of course, because it was just a vampire book, nobody cared at all. But in terms of educating myself in the process of researching, it was really very, very useful.
So were the vampire books all published?
Yeah.
But they just didn't do squat.
I think it has to be admitted they weren't on the kind of Stephanie Meyer, Anne Rice level of success.
But so did you find that doing the research was more enjoyable than actually constructing the fiction?
No, I found that the process of doing the research, the thing I love most about it is where you see suddenly chain reactions are set up. You see ways in which facts can be blended together to generate a narrative or an unexpected perspective or something like that. But in a sense, it's the process of writing that enables that really to catch fire. So the best is where the research is gelling with the process of writing.
Yeah, I can see that. Do you have it all in your? I mean, you presumably take lots and lots of notes.
Yeah.
And then do you have this amazing retentive memory where you can just sort of have the broad overall structure, which you then just nip back into your notes again?
The truth is that I wanted to be a writer, and I think that I am still a writer rather than a historian. The thing about history is that it is probably the only academic discipline that can simultaneously be a branch of literature, and I think that it can take some writers are very lucky; they find the way in which they're meant to write immediately, but it can take other writers quite a long time to work out actually what it is that they are best suited to and what they most enjoy doing, and it took me, basically a decade to work out that I was better suited to writing history than I was to writing fiction. But the kind of history that I write, I'm interested in the literary quality of history. And that's particularly an aspect of why I write about ancient or medieval history, is that a lot of what we laughably call the primary sources for ancient history are actually not primary sources in the way that a modern historian would describe them. They are not eyewitness accounts. They are not stuff that you get from archives. These are already shaped as literature. So if you're talking about Herodotus or Tacitus, these are highly literary writers. Yeah. And so in a sense, I want to write what I think happened, but simultaneously, I do it with an awareness that we can never ultimately know what happened, because our sources are already shaped as literature. And so in a sense, what I'm trying to write works that can simultaneously give as close an approximation as I can provide as to what I think happened, while simultaneously saying, actually, this is inevitably literary, because we cannot get back to what actually happened. So this presumably
is why you prefer going up to the Anglo-Saxon times and no later, generally.
Well, I think you can do it right the way forward, but I think that, I suppose in a sense, looking back to vampires, part of the fascination of vampires is that you can present to readers things that obviously didn't happen as fact. The understanding of the supernatural that someone may have in ancient Egypt or in the 17th century or even in the 19th century is not what a modern rationalist today would have. And yet people's understanding of the supernatural is as much a part of their mental furniture as the kind of food they eat or the clothes that they wear. And so that's also, I've been very drawn to people's understanding of the dimension of the supernatural, the dimension of the divine, because actually I think that in a way has shaped, that is the real inheritance from the ancient past that we have, is people's understanding of the supernatural far more than anything else. And that's kind of been a process of self-discovery. So it's why the current book I'm writing is a book about Christianity as a revolutionary force that has utterly transformed not just Europe, but the entire world. And in a sense, that is the ultimate inheritance from antiquity, is Christianity, or Islam as well.
Yeah, interesting that. So do you think that there is, no matter how advanced and sophisticated we get, that there is still this basic human need for the spiritual, the supernatural and stuff, and if it's not manifested through organised religion like Christianity, it becomes something else like environmentalism? I mean, are we all still basically?
Well, I think it's profounder than that. I think that our understanding of what the spiritual is in the West is so shaped by Christianity that it's almost impossible to escape from it. It's kind of like hugging the tar baby. We as a society have been hugging the tar baby of Christianity for so long that we simply cannot extract ourselves. It's almost impossible. And even the very process of imagining that you're doing so, perhaps by becoming an atheist, perhaps by proclaiming your secularism, these are concepts that are shaped by our Christian inheritance so profoundly that I think that in the modern West, to be an atheist is to kind of pay homage to the Christian inheritance. And of course you bring up environmentalism, and so I know your views on global warming.
I've kept them very quiet, but
I know you have. You've hidden your light under a bushel there. Yeah. So I personally, for what it's worth, am absolutely persuaded that global warming is happening. Yeah. But I also think that the way in which we respond to that fact is profoundly shaped, for instance, by the inheritance of apocalypticism that runs throughout Christian history. This notion that at the end of days, the world will be consumed by great catastrophes, and that humans will be judged for their crimes. And a lot of the way in which writings about global warming are framed are profoundly moral. There is this sense in which we as a species have done wrong and we will be judged at the end of days. And I think that absolutely, that's not to say that I think global warming is happening, but I think that the way in which it is framed in moral terms by environmentalists owes a lot more to the Christian inheritance than perhaps a lot of them would immediately recognise.
But of course, it's not just Christianity. You look at Aztecs and Mayans. You look at biblical
Well,
Sumerians.
yes, I mean,
they all have the same sense that at some point they're going to be punished for their sins on earth by natural catastrophes.
Yes. I mean, it's a little. So these beliefs are a little bit like the kind of software that runs a Macintosh or a PC or whatever. Once you've mastered it, then you can see how everything else works. So looking at the Aztecs, objectively, their beliefs look repellent to us. So the mass slaughter for which they are notorious, the Chippy, the Lord, the flayed one, whose priests would not just kill victims but skin them and then wear those skins, and on particular feast days they would run around the town wearing these flayed skins, kind of killing people that way. So I mean, it gives a whole new shade of meaning to the concept of a public holiday. Or the most repellent one of all, Tlaloc, the god of the rains. You would appease him by giving him the sacrifice of children, but the children had to be made to weep before the sacrifice would be rendered acceptable. So it's understandable why, Christian priest coming and recording this, what the fuck? Yeah. This is absolutely horrible. Yeah. But of course, once you realize what's going on, that actually for the Aztecs, there is this dread that the world will come to an end unless the gods are given this sacrifice of blood. And that those who are being killed are being given the opportunity to be complicit in this. So they are kind of helping to save the world. And once you've bought into that framework of understanding, that conceptualization of the universe, then it all makes perfect sense in exactly the same way that Christianity makes perfect sense if you buy into its controlling narratives. So in a sense, there is a kind of a compatibility there between the Spanish arriving in Mexico and the civilization that they are overthrowing. But of course, the similarities only serve to highlight the way in which they are also profoundly different. And one of the ways in which modern liberalism is clearly the heir of Christianity is the way in which it assumes that its values are universal and that it contains the wherewithal to absorb every other belief system, every other way of seeing the world into its own big tent. And that has always been the kind of, simultaneously, the great conceit and the great cause of potency of Christianity. And I think that the whole framework of kind of universal human rights, of liberalism, of universalism, is clearly the inheritor of that kind of mingled Christian conceit and kind of ideological potency.
It sounds like this is going to be your magnum opus, this new book.
Inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah. Well, just rewind two questions I wanted to ask you, and they're completely different. The first one is vampires. Very important, this one. What is your favourite vampire movie?
I don't really like vampire. I find them a bit silly, to be honest. So it's quite a kind of odd thing. So I think that vampire films are silly. I've never found them remotely frightening.
Not even Salem's Lot?
No.
Not even The Master?
No. I've never found vampire films frightening. I liked the idea of Byron as a vampire, right, because I think that Byron is a great cultural literary figure, and therefore there's a kind of interest in how it was that he ended up becoming the prototype for the vampire. But in themselves, I'm not particularly frightened by vampires.
Okay. After that,
zombies, I find frightening.
Oh, do you? So yeah. You like The Walking Dead?
Yeah, I find that frightening.
Do you think the zombies in Walking Dead are less or more frightening than the ones in World War Z?
Well, it's not so much the zombies themselves. It's the idea of the entire world collapsing. But it's the idea of civilization collapsing. So on that, the most frightening zombies are probably the 28 Days After, for me, because that's set in England.
Right.
So it's quite frightening seeing America or, Jerusalem or whatever being attacked by zombies. But particularly America, you just expect that America is going to be taken over by zombies. It's just part of the territory. Yeah. Seeing England taken over is much more frightening because that's your own backyard.
The ones in World War Z, they're dangerous because they move much more rapidly than the ones in Walking Dead. I mean, the ones in Walking Dead... Yeah,
so they're just shuffling
They shuffle around. World War Z, the way they swarm over the walls into Israel is just terrifying. You can't do much about them.
Well, you slightly get that in 20 Days After as well.
Do you?
They kind of they dance as well as
Do
swarm.
they? I haven't seen 28 Days.
So it's like being menaced by kind of proponents of modern dance.
So,
okay.
okay. That I'll check that one out.
Yeah.
When I was growing up, I used to love books like Day of the Triffids because I love these.
Well, John Wyndham is I found the single most frightening science fiction writer. Again, because it was set in this, it was always set in this kind of 1950s idea of England, where the whole idea was that it was incredibly dull and nothing happened. It was kind of like, going back to Ladybird books, it's like the original Ladybird books, kind of Peter and Jane, really, really dull. And then suddenly giant carnivorous plants are attacking you, or
There's one.
telepathic mutant twins. I mean, very, very frightening.
Like they've done Pride and Prejudice and zombies, but what about Peter and Jane and zombies? That would be good.
Well, the Midwich Cuckoos are basically Peter and Jane. It's those kind of blonde children that you get in those 1960s, 1970s children books, but they can communicate telepathically and they're out to wipe out the whole of humanity. And of course, young children with murderous powers are always the most frightening thing of all.
Yes. Or those horror films that begin with children going, ring a ring a roses.
Yeah.
And you think, oh.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you've seen Les Revenants, the French.
I love Les Revenants.
Well, you remember, the most frightening one of those, which is also a kind of zombie film, but it's not, because it's the dead coming back and they're not zombies. They're still, is Victor.
Victor, yeah. No.
The young boy who just kind of, great wide eyes and he just stares at you and you'd keel over in terror, I think.
I think that was one of the great TV series of the. I mean,
Yes.
Series 2, absolute drivel. I had to give up after a while because they didn't really know what they were doing. But the first series.
Well, yes, it was a bit like Lost, I suppose, which I never saw, but I gather, it was kind of set up, the premise was so wonderful, and then they couldn't solve it. And there was slightly the same thing with Les Revenants, that they weren't able to solve it.
This is a whole separate podcast. I just squeeze in the other question that was prompted by our earlier discussion, which was, because you sort of fell accidentally into being an historian, do you find that there's a certain type of historian which goes, well, of course, he's just a narrative historian. He doesn't really go to primary sources. And
well, I do go to primary sources, but as I'm saying, the primary sources for ancient history are not primary sources as we would understand. Well, I've been treated with immense generosity by academic historians. The first person that I ever sent a work of history that I'd written, Rubicon, was to Mary Beard, back before she became the most famous historian in the world. And she was unfailingly kind and generous, and gave all kinds of comments on it. It was very supportive. Likewise, with Persian Fire, I sent it to Amelie Kurt, who is a great, probably the world's leading specialist on the Persians, and I sent Paul Cartledge, great historian of Sparta and of Athens, and I remember taking them both to a Persian restaurant, and thinking, I'm living the dream, listening to these great historians, not only talk to them but talk to me, and so I feel incredibly grateful to them. Equally, of course, there are historians who absolutely hate it, but
Yes.
I dismiss them as
Actually,
embittered.
I have to say,
killjoys.
Tom, just spending a few hours with you, I do love having you on hand. It's great to have an historian on tap. When I'm very, very rich, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have a sort of retinue of
courtiers,
who are going to be
eunuchs,
well,
eunuch
whatever.
historians.
You're going to be one of them.
I can't wait for the snip.
And no, and you can just tell me stuff because you've got lots in your head. I mean, you read great classics.
No, I did English.
You did English?
Yes, but I did classical languages as part of that. So I kept the classical languages going.
You're pretty good at your Latin and your Greek, yeah? I mean,
well, it fades very, very quickly.
Does it?
I find it fades very quickly, but it's kind of dormant. So
you did
I just
English.
have to water it a bit.
You did English you were at Cambridge, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which college?
Queen's.
It's
which I went to because there are two queens, both from the Wars of the Roses. So I like the idea that you get kind of
that was
double
your
for your buck.
esoteric reason for choosing it.
Yeah.
It's very weird how even now I know way more Oxford people than Cambridge people.
Well, that's because we're all Puritans who want to stop you having fun.
That's it, isn't
And
it?
that's not your bag, is it, James?
No, you are different, you lot.
Yes, we just want to go around banning things and being priggish.
Yeah. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special, and I think you'll agree, utterly fascinating guest, Tom Holland. More in a moment.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlow.
Censorship is a key issue here, particularly for people on the right. Do you think it was addressed adequately?
Definitely not. It was useful to name check Diamond and Silk. It was useful to check even politicians who had campaign ads that were shut down. But in every case, Zuckerberg was allowed to essentially dismiss the case and move on.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays at 6 a.m. Eastern on SiriusXM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special and utterly fascinating guest, Tom Holland. Tom, about last year, you did something that just blew me away. I was so impressed by your courage, because you're not...
do go on.
Yeah.
Let's talk about how brave I am.
Well, I am. And do you know what? I really, totally mean it. I'd say that anyone who knows you would not think of you necessarily as a man of action. Would that be fair?
I don't know. I'm swashbuckling sportsman.
Yeah. Oh, so I'd forgotten how you see yourself.
Whereas I don't think it's just how I see myself. I have won an international sporting award for my cricket prowess.
Just remind me what that was. How could I?
There's an organisation called Cricket World which hands out votes for best performance in amateur cricket every week. And
every week,
I took 5 wickets and got put up for this. And simply by force of invoking the power of social media, I was able to crush all the other people on the list who were clearly much more deserving than me. And I was able to scoop the prize. And I have a little cricket cap with a tassel on it with Player of the Week on it. So I'm not having any of this.
Okay.
You're a kind of a feat, man of inaction. I am an award-winning sportsman, James. And I imagine you haven't had many award-winning sportsmen on your podcasts.
No, it's true. I haven't.
So you're free to apologise.
I'm really sorry for underestimating your courage and your sporting prowess. Were you one of those people like me who was really shit at sport at school?
Yes.
And I'm
still shit. I'm still shit. I've always been shit. But I kind of created a fantasy world in which occasionly the fantasy obtrudes through into the reality and becomes the truth.
I know that you don't like to talk about it, but I believe you did once hit a 6.
Yes,
you?
I've hit a 6 and it was photographed more than anything else.
Well,
and it was brilliant. I just set up a Twitter account and was kind of in a rather muscle-bound way earnestly tweeting stuff about my books because I'd been told to by the publisher. And then I hit the 6 and it got photographed. And I suddenly thought, shit, I could just retweet this again. So I put it out again and then I could do it again. And I think I tweeted it about 10 times and then I did it 20 times the following day. And I think since then I've probably tweeted it about 1,000 times.
But I think,
and I've got it into the Wall Street Journal, the Times of India, I think the BBC webpage. I mean, it's the single most exciting thing that's ever happened to me.
Is it really? Who was it against?
Well, let's not go into that.
Which school children?
Yeah, it was against a team of school children.
Did they do was it an underarm bowl?
It was very, very fast. I think he was 15 and he was very quick for his age.
Okay. And do you, as you struck the ball, I mean, this is going to be boring as fuck for my American listener who's going to be thinking...
it's like baseball. It's the simple... It's like the bullfighter. It's primal. There is this very hard object being propelled at you, and your every instinct is screaming, jump out of the way, and instead you stand there and you treat it mano a mano and you smash it and it goes miles.
And as you struck it, were you aware that this is a...
No, I thought it was going to be caught, in which case I would have been out.
Yes.
So for Americans, that's bad.
Yes, that's bad.
But instead it went over, so it was like a home run.
Yeah. I once had a similar experience where I was really, really crap at, well, all sports at school apart from cross-country running. But I was in the fourth 15, rugby 15 at my prep school. And as you can imagine, if you're in the fourth 15, you don't get many away fixtures or any fixtures at all because you're absolute rubbish. And I was full back. And it was the one sporting occasion where my dad came to watch me.
Did you cover yourself with glory?
I scored a try from pretty much
you must have been so proud.
The back line of my end, and I ran all the way through. I weaved through all the
like
other...
a hot knife through butter.
It was just extraordinary, and I still remember it.
Yeah,
I remember that sensation.
That's why you do it, isn't it?
Absolutely. So, okay. So now we know that what I'm about to describe didn't involve courage. It was just normal behaviour. But you made this amazing documentary. Remind me what it was called?
It was called ISIS: The Origins of Evil.
ISIS: The Origins of Evil. Well, I mean, already it's got ISIS in the title, so you know what's going to come. But you went out to... Was it Iraq and Syria, or just Iraq?
It was to Iraq, but we did very fleetingly pop into Syria because we went to northern Iraq, so basically Kurdistan, which is perfectly safe. You know, lots of Western people are there. But at the time we went there, the Peshmerga, the Kurdish militia, were fighting ISIS. So the ISIS front line was kind of, you know, not very far away. And we got access to a town called Sinjar, which had been the main centre of habitation for the Yazidis. And the Yazidis were the people with this kind of peculiar syncretic religion combining elements of Islam, Christianity, Judaism, pagan religion, who, when ISIS overran northern Iraq, took Mosul, they also took Sinjar, and they took control of the Yazidis. And the Yazidis were the particular object of their genocidal fury because the Quran prescribes that Jews and Christians should be tolerated provided that they pay a tax and acknowledge their inferiority to Islam. But Yazidis are seen as being pagan and therefore are liable for the men to be killed and the women to be enslaved, and that is exactly what happened. And Sinjar was the centre of this genocide that ISIS launched against them. And it got recaptured by the Peshmerga, but it remained absolutely on the front line. So the ISIS positions were 1.5 miles away across kind of open terrain from Sinjar, so within mortar range. And when we got there, we didn't know whether we would have what kind of access we would have to the front line. But we were very lucky in our fixes. We were very lucky in the way that we were able to pull contacts, and we got permission to go to Sinjar. The director was thrilled about this. He's a very brave man. Our cameraman, there's nothing he enjoys more than being shot at. So he was ecstatically happy about this. I was cacking myself. Yeah. I desperately didn't want to go there, but because everyone else was so excited, I just had to smile wanly. So, but to get to Sinjar from where we were based in Kurdistan to Sinjar normally would be a kind of 40-mile drive along a straight road. But because ISIS were lying in the way, we had to go in a massive roundabout way, which involved going directly along the frontier between Iraq and Syria. So whenever you were paused for a pee, you had the choice of, shall I pee in Iraq or shall I pee in Syria? And so obviously you're going to pee in Syria just so that you can say you've been in Syria.
Yeah.
And the whole thing was just...
Can I just go back a bit? When you when you agreed to make this documentary, you were not expecting to go to the front line, were you?
We didn't know. We didn't know where we wanted. I think we kind of wanted to,
or rather, the director did.
The director did. Yeah. But I don't think we thought that we would get to Sinjar.
Right. Because was it Mount Sinjar where they all fled and were sort of dying of thirst?
So the reason that the Yazidis gather around Sinjar is because for that is where the Yazidis think that Noah in his ark landed.
Right.
And it's basically the biblical story with the addition of the fact that they scraped the hull, it was going to sink, and a large snake plugged it. So that's part of the story. And the other part of the story is that rather landing on Mount Ararat, they landed on Mount Sinjar. So it's a very holy place for the Yazidis. So there's lots of them gathered all around it. And when ISIS came, Yazidis fled up onto the mountain, and they were then defended by one of the Kurdish factions. It's all incredibly complicated, but it adds to the excitement of it that the faction that defended them were the PKK, who are the people that the Turks hate. Yes. That Erdogan is going after, because they're the people who launched terrorist attacks in Turkey. So they're regarded as a terrorist groups by Western countries. But for the Yazidis, they were the saviors. So one of the things that added, I mean, there were all kinds of excitements going to Sinjar, but one of the things that added the excitement is that there were crack squads of the PKK up on Mount Sinjar. And they were absolutely gorgeous young women. So they were crack squads of basically Marxist nuns. So they were all in combat fatigues. Yep. I mean, all very, very attractive. And we turned up, and they invited us to have supper, and we'd sit around, and they'd all be kind of, I mean, it was like my kind of eldest daughter's friends.
Yeah.
And then suddenly you'd ask a question, I don't know, about the future of Iraq or Turkey or whatever. And suddenly they would be talking, Marxism, dialectic, inevitable triumph of the proletariat, all this kind of thing. And then it would snap off, and they'd go back to... But it felt absolutely like this was a kind of warrior band of religious devotees. And it was really very, very odd.
Yeah.
And they all had huge guns.
But quite sexy, clearly.
Well, yes. I mean, yes.
So, so the PKK why did they protect the Yazidis? Was it just because territorially that was where they were?
Well, for the PKK, ISIS are in every way the enemy. Because the PKK are very anti-religious, so they're Marxists. They stepped in when the Kurdish militia, the Peshmerga, were less than stalwart. But the Peshmerga have now recaptured Sinjar, so they were the ones in situ in Sinjar itself, and the PKK were up on the mountain. I mean, it's all just an unbelievable snarl of kind of ideological loyalties and complexities, and the Yazidis are unbelievably vulnerable and so they look for protection where they can get it. The Yazidis are dependent on both the Peshmerga and the PKK, right. But certainly our fixers were particularly grateful to the PKK.
I was very, very moved by the scenes with the Yazidis. It was absolutely fascinating watching these. I mean, they're pre-Christian, I mean, it's almost
well,
like
I think they're post.
Are they?
Well, nobody's really sure where they come from,
right? Because
it's a preeminently oral culture, and so therefore it's very difficult to precisely work out where and when certain beliefs that they articulate may have originated. They kind of light fires, as Zoroastrians do. They pray 5 times a day, as Muslims do. They baptize people, as Christians do. They have stories of Noah, as the Jews do. The most intriguing aspect of all is that in their main shrine, which is way back from Sinjar, so that was never under threat. That's kind of deep in Kurdistan. They have this room which is dedicated to a being called Sheikh Shams. And you ask, well, who is Sheikh Shams? And they don't really know, but it's something to do with the sun, something to do with the light and the radiance and the power of the sun. And the god of the sun in Babylon was called Shamash. And it's possible that Sheikh Shams is the last living incarnation in any belief system in the world of this ancient sun god of Babylon. So you look into this room, and perhaps you are looking into something inordinately precious, which is the last survival of, the gods that were worshipped not just in Mesopotamia but actually in Syria as well. And it's incredibly kind of eerie, dislocating, powerful feeling to have that. And so in a sense, quite apart from the human horrors that were inflicted on these people, there's also the sense that culturally they represent something inordinately precious as well.
Yeah. First of all, how safe are they now?
They're not safe at all. They're not safe at all. When we were driving down towards Sinjar and we were going through all these various villages, there were certain villages where it wasn't safe to get out, because although they were now no longer under ISIS control, they were full of ISIS sympathizers. And then there were villages where there was kind of majority Yazidi, where it was safe. These people are surrounded by people who tried to kill them. So it's as though, after the Second World War, there were Jews who were still surrounded by active Nazis.
Right.
And so they live with the constant knowledge that people who were their neighbours tried to kill them. And the scale of the horror that was inflicted on them is something that simply hasn't had the traction in the West that really I think it should have done.
Yeah.
Because when they came in, the horrors that ISIS inflicted were kind of an order that you read about in ancient history. So they took the men and they crucified them, and they put their heads on poles all around the town. They took so the single most frightening moment for me was we wanted to see a mass grave which had been found, and I had thought that we would be taken by the Peshmerga somewhere relatively behind the front line. No, we went out through the blast walls that guard Sinjar from ISIS attacks out into the no man's land, and there was the ruins of this huge great silo. And what had happened was that ISIS had rounded up all the women from the local area, taken them into this barn, and divided them up into those who were sexually attractive enough to serve them as sex slaves, and they'd been taken off to Mosul, where they were sold off. And all the other women, so the older women, were taken out from the barn and gunned down. And we got there, and our security advisor, who was ex-SAS, who'd been very mellow up to that point, suddenly started, oh fuck, because ISIS were kind of half a mile away, and he said, we're in sniper range now, we've got 20 minutes because that's how long it will take them to come and grab us if that's what they want to do. So we didn't even have time to recce the ground. I just walked out being filmed and looked at this graveyard, and there were bones still everywhere because they hadn't been able to bury them, and there were kind of bits of hair, and and you read stuff about the pogroms and the mass slaughter in the Second World War, and you never think that you're going to see that again. The great never again, we're never going to allow this, and yet this happened, and it's like nobody in the West really gives a shit. And the reason nobody gives a shit, as a Yazidi and a refugee I spoke to said, is that in the West you have Christians, you have Muslims, you have Jews who will speak up for their respective co-religionists, but who cares about the Yazidis? Who cares about them? Given that, and they're still susceptible to this. The ideology that sanctioned what ISIS did is still a going concern. Yeah. People, there are still Muslims who are buying into this idea that as pagans they deserve death.
Given that genocide, according to the UN and everyone else in sort of global authority, is the number one crime, and given that this is patently genocide.
Yes, although there are large numbers of countries, and that are very reluctant to describe it as a genocide, because that then obliges them.
Yeah. So what?
But I don't really know what you can do. I mean, that's the awful thing. You kind of like to think that there is a solution. I don't see that there is a solution, really.
Really? So even if President Trump listens to this podcast, what could he do?
What could he do? Because the ideology is deeply rooted in texts that lots of Muslims believe are sacrosanct.
Yeah. That is so awful. That is so depressing.
So there's plenty within Islam that would say, no, this is terrible. God is all just. God is all merciful. There's plenty there, but there is also indisputably plenty there that licenses this. And as part of the film, another very kind of hairy thing that we did was we went to speak to a very, very senior Salafist in Jordan who'd been in prison with al-Zarqawi, who's the guy who led the murderous attempt to stoke sectarian killing in Iraq after the American invasion. And we'd been trying to speak to him for a long time, and he finally said, yes, I'll speak to you. And we went to Amman, dropped the hat, and we had to go to this block of flats on the outskirts of Amman and wait for him. I was very nervous as to what, Anyway, he turned up, and he was for about 40 minutes. He didn't give us very much, and then suddenly he started saying, yes, they have to die because they're pagans, and that's what the Quran says, and that's what the example of Muhammad teaches us is that we must do. And while there are people who are able to draw this reading from Islamic scriptures, I don't see that the Yazidis can possibly consider themselves to be safe.
No.
And if you think about the inheritance of anti-Semitism in Christian Europe, part of what happened in the wake of the Holocaust was that at the most fundamental level, Christian leaders had to face up to the fact that the Gospels themselves had contributed to the climate of anti-Jewish hostility that had culminated in the Holocaust. So on the profoundest theological level, there was a need for Christian leaders, Christian theologians, to face up to this and to try and combat it. And I think that a similar process needs to happen in Islam, that Muslim scholars need to accept that this isn't just a kind of aberration, that this is part of the fabric of Islamic scripture. And therefore, if you don't want to see people like the Yazidis living in danger of genocide, that needs to be faced up to, and an explanation that is, that is drawn from the kind of the moral core of Islam needs to be formulated, that says why this is simply an inadequate interpretation of what the Quran says, or what the examples of Muhammad's life would lead you to believe.
Yeah.
There are other ways of interpreting it, but it requires people to accept, this was done in Islam's name, and this was drawing on traditions that have been historically part of Islam, and we need to face up to that in exactly the way that the Christians did in the wake of the Holocaust.
You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Tom Holland.
Breitbart News Tonight with Joel Pollack and Rebecca Mansour.
I think that it's the epitome of hypocrisy. Unless you fall in line with their liberal agenda, this uniparty, globalist, liberal agenda, they will never support you. They use the whole gender issue, of course, as some kind of tool to prop up their messaging, but it's the phoniest thing.
Sirius XM Patriot Channel 125. This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special and fascinating guest, Tom Holland. Tom, before we move on to the subjects dearest to your heart, apart from cricket, I just wanted to ask you briefly, did you get any sleep when you were out in Iraq?
Not very much. I had the worst night of my life there. When we were going to Sinjar, our security advisor, the SAS guy, had a friend of his who was working on the north side, so the safe side of Mount Sinjar, clearing mines. And we went in to see him because we wanted to scope out what the situation was in Sinjar. And he said, you'll be fine, just as long as you don't stay in between the two communication towers, because they're shelling everything in between the communication towers. We went to see the Peshmerga commander, who said, you must stay with me. You are my guests. And of course, they were situated directly between the communication towers. That's why ISIS were firing their mortars at it. And there was nothing we couldn't refuse his invitation. So we had to stay there. And I had terrible shits. And so as a great honor, he said, you must come and stay in my personal room. I had to go and have a shit every 40 minutes, and the toilet was the worst toilet in Iraq, and it was outside in the garden, and I had to get out, go through a kind of barrack room full of very, very hairy Kurdish militiamen, every 40 minutes, squat in this horrible toilet, and then go back. And of course, and it was 50 degrees. There was a power cut. The fan didn't work. I was kind of paranoid that because the going rate for a Westerner is $200,000, ISIS will pay $200,000 for a Westerner. All it would take would be one of them to, just grab you. It was the worst night of my life. Absolutely the worst night of my life.
And presumably you had to wear a flak jacket when you went outside in case they started mortaring you.
No. Only when you went out into kind of... Because if you get hit by a mortar, you're going to get hit by a mortar.
Because people think it's all glamour, don't they, TV?
Yeah.
You didn't get any awards or anything for any...
No, I really should have done, obviously.
Obviously. I mean, it's up there with your six in its way.
Yes, absolutely. Dashing display of heroism. I mean, it was... I don't remember kind of particularly low moments in your life.
Yeah.
But I remember kind of feeling the spray of my liquid shit melting around my heels.
What am I doing?
In this unbearable heat, thinking I might be killed. I was just so horrible.
Oh, that is...
But, I mean, the amazing thing is that people in Iraq live like that all the time.
Yes.
All the time. And, for me, it was a kind of, bit of tourism.
Well, do you remember that famous phrase that they won't send in... American CIA operatives don't want to work where diarrhea is a way of life. It was... Yeah. No podcast with Tom Holland would be complete without the discussion of two of the major concerns in your life, apart from cricket and apart from the Yazidis. The first of which is Stonehenge.
Yes.
Tell us about... Because I this is a campaign I think I could get behind as well. I think we should all get behind it.
Well, you're a Conservative, James.
Yeah.
And Conservatives are there to conserve things. And I would say that one thing that is absolutely worth conserving is the most significant prehistoric landscape in Europe, which is the landscape around Stonehenge. Now, that landscape is under greater threat than it's been in millennia. And the reason for that, paradoxically, is an attempt to try and improve it. So what's happening is anyone who's been to Stonehenge will know that there is a major road, the A303, which runs almost directly past it. It's great if you're, driving straight through because you can have a look at the stones. It's not so good if you're in a hurry to get to Cornwall because you may well be stuck in a traffic jam on a bank holiday. It's not so great if you're standing actually visiting Stonehenge because you have the distant rumble of lorries going past. So for all those reasons, it might seem brilliant that the government is investing £1.8 billion in building a tunnel that will sink the A303 beneath the ground and enable people to enjoy Stonehenge with just the kind of sound of birdsong in the distance. What's to object? Well, actually, loads. There's loads to object because the point about Stonehenge is that it does not exist in isolation. It exists in the context of the plain that is all around it, where new finds are being made all the time. And the mark of this is that the United Nations has designated a World Heritage Site, so not just Stonehenge, but miles around. And the government is planning to drive not just the tunnel, but 4-lane highways through this most sensitive of landscapes. And an example of the damage that this threatens is that there is an ongoing dig just right by where they want to build the kind of entranceway into the tunnels. So you can imagine the amount of concrete, of tarmac that is projected there. This site is called Blickmead. It goes all the way back to the very beginnings of continuous human settlement in this country. They have found auroch footprints. Aurochs are kind of great extinct kind of bison. They found even paved stones. So incredible proofs of early human settlement. And it's evident that this is kind of where Stonehenge begins because it's just round from a spring, which was, it was a holy spring in the Middle Ages. There were votive offerings made right the way through the Saxon period, Roman period, Iron Age, Bronze Age, presumably going all the way back. So in a sense, this is the beginning of Britain itself. This is where it all begins. And the reason that the site at Blickmead has survived is because there is a water table, and the water is what enables the organic material to be preserved. Now, if you build an enormous tunnel, that water table is going to be devastated. So everything will dry up, and within a decade, everything will be lost. So we know at Blickmead what we're losing. There are unknown. Well, let's say there are known unknowns.
Yeah.
We don't know what we're going to lose. And it's highly probable that there are amazing things to be found directly under the A303. Now, that's fine. We don't have to dig up the A303, but we know that they're probably there because a road, in the scale of things, that can come, that can go. If you sink a tunnel, that's there forever. You're never going to get rid of that.
What would your preferred solution be?
Well, my preferred solution would be a longer tunnel, so one that goes under the whole of the heritage site and avoids prehistoric finds.
And goes
but that is, of course,
goes deeper.
No, it's not the depth. It's the entrance points, and it's the tarmac. It's the expansion of the roads. But I think that would be prohibitively expensive. I think that the status quo would be preferable. Yeah. Actually, the tailbacks are not that bad. Yeah. It only tends to happen at bank holidays or Friday evenings. Or a bypass that goes south, perhaps around Salisbury.
Right.
But I think that there are, and it's 1.8 billion. So with 1.8 billion, it should be possible to find a cheaper way.
And are your criticisms gaining any traction?
I hope so. I mean, I think that the difficulty is, objectively, you think, well, this is wonderful, way of getting rid of the road past Stonehenge. But once you explain everything that's at risk, I think people do go, wow, we can't have that. And to give the government credit, I mean, I think that the government wanted to do it in all good faith. I think that they thought that they were doing the right thing. So really, it's a kind of attempt to try and persuade MPs, these are the people with the power to decide whether it goes ahead or not, that actually that they risk making a calamitous mistake that subsequent generations will look back and say, what were they thinking?
Yeah.
Because this is one of the most iconic places, not just in Britain but in the world.
No, everyone's heard of Stonehenge.
It's an absolute A-list site.
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing you want to preserve, and I'm totally with you on this one, hedgehogs. Yeah. Because I knew I was going to be coming to speak to you about this, and I knew hedgehogs were concerned, I consulted my good friend Christopher Booker, who's quite good on naturalism and stuff, and he told me some shocking statistics, which is that in the 1950s, the UK hedgehog population was 50 million. Now it's 1.5 million.
Yeah.
That really is worrying.
Yeah, it's incredibly worrying. I mean, I have. I'm not a naturalist at all in any way, but I'm kind of very romantic, and the animal life is a crucial part for me of the pleasure I get in living in Britain. It's part of the fabric of what I've grown up with, and I do not want to see it go. And I feel that we, as the human population, have a kind of duty of care to the animal population. We are the trustees. We do not have the right to push other species into extinction, and we should be doing all that we can to try and ensure that they can survive as well. And hedgehogs are a kind of bellwether species, because if the hedgehogs are doing badly, then lots of other kind of animals are doing badly. Lots of insects, lots of invertebrates, lots of flowers are doing badly as well. And if we want a kind of, a thermometer to take the temperature of where the natural world is in Britain, it's not looking good. Because if a species that was as plentiful, as numerous as the hedgehog is in trouble, then it suggests that a lot else is as well. And there's the paradox of Britain is that as a country, we're probably more committed to conserving the natural world than almost any other. More people in Britain belong to wildlife preservation societies than in almost any other country. And yet our landscape is as denuded and decimated as almost any other.
Yes.
And there's a kind of strange paradox there. And I think that hedgehogs there's a kind of romance about them. There's the role, Mrs. Tiggy Winkle, say Beatrix Potter. It's part of children's books. I think that people my age, I'm 50 now, I think they were part of my childhood. I remember in our garden a hedgehog being trapped in a net, and of course it had rolled up into a ball because it was frightened, it was struggling. Its instinct therefore was to roll into a ball, which just made the net even worse. We were able to cut it free, and it kind of dusted itself down and walked busily off. And it was kind of, from that point on, I was in love. But it was also the kind of the pathos of the fact that its instinctive reaction to danger is so often inadequate to the danger that it confronted. So lots of listeners may remember the Not the 9 O'Clock News song about trucking.
Oh yes,
and the whole joke was the truck would flatten hedgehogs, and the truck driver would lean out and put another kind of hedgehog logo as it crushed one. But the whole point of that was that hedgehogs were plentiful back then, because roadkill was the index of the fact of how many hedgehogs there are. Nobody now would get that joke because no one's crushing hedgehogs. There aren't any hedgehogs left to be killed.
Totally true.
So
there were so many squashed hedgehogs on the roads.
And now if you see a squashed hedgehog, it's a kind of thing of wonder. So driving here in France, we saw a squashed hérisson.
Yeah.
Great joy. Hedgehogs are clearly doing better in France.
Yeah. Now, we've discussed this before, and what you call a paradox about the fact that our environmental concern is greater than ever, and yet here is this species threatened. I know we're going to differ slightly on this issue, but I know that definitely one of the main causes of the decline of the hedgehog, because there is a distinct correlation between protected legislation, is the explosion of the badger population, which is hedgehogs, apart from maybe the truck, is the hedgehog's biggest predator.
Yes, because badgers can slice hedgehogs open even when they curl into balls.
They do that, and actually, in the period since the badger protection legislation was introduced, hedgehog populations have halved in that period. Now, I like badgers, by the way, but I do remember in my lifetime I've noticed that I'd never seen a badger when I was a child. And then there was this phase, and red kites went through a similar phase, where one was encouraged to celebrate this charismatic species. And you've got people like Chris Packham. Chris Packham on these nature programs singing the praises of badgers, and to the point where if you criticize badgers, if you say there are too many of them and they're killing hedgehogs, you are basically a complete bastard. I once did an Any Questions episode in Wales, and the crowd. It was in Machynlleth, which is one of the epicenters of ecology in the UK, and when the badger issue came up, the audience went absolutely bananas, and we virtually had to be escorted out by security.
James, I knew that. It's so Delingpole to we're talking about hedgehogs that you would fix on badgers. You are right, absolutely, that where there are large populations of badgers, there tend not to be many hedgehogs left, and I think that is clearly an aspect of it. But the reason why is because badgers and hedgehogs are essentially competing over increasingly attenuated regions of the biosphere. It's not that badgers are responsible for the collapse in hedgehog numbers. I mean, they are a contributory factor, but they're a contributory factor because of much profounder and much more unsettling reasons, which essentially is the destruction of the landscape that would enable badgers, hedgehogs, birds, insects, the entire kind of framework of the natural world in Britain to survive, that it's just been irradiated. And one of the strange things about the hedgehog population is that they are actually doing relatively better in suburban areas than they are in regions like Lincolnshire or Huntingdonshire or East Anglia. And what that suggests is that actually there is a need for a coordinated attempt by government, by agriculture, by road builders, by everybody essentially who's responsible for the look and the functioning of the countryside, to decide whether conserving our wildlife is sufficiently important to actually factor that into the way that land is used in this country. Personally, I think it is. I mean, I can understand that there might be lots of people who don't think that, but I think it is. And I think that, our children's children, if they grow up in a country without hedgehogs, they will be living in a country that is immeasurably impoverished in ways that simply cannot be expressed in a kind of balance sheet.
I totally agree with you, Tom, about that. When I was younger, a younger man, when I was quite pretty and sort of, had long girly hair, I was inundated by older men persuading me that I was in fact really gay if only I but knew it, and that if only I liberated my inner gayness, I would be so much happier and I'd be able to sleep with them then. And I do sometimes feel that way with you. You are
Really?
You are
That's
basically
come on.
deep inside. You are basically James Delingpole. You are. I mean, you are so sound in so many ways, and I so admire you.
Well,
and
I think that I am clearly small c conservative.
Yeah.
All the things that really get me going are things that are in danger, that I don't want to lose. So all the things we've talked about, whether be it Yazidi, the Yazidi religion, or Stonehenge, or hedgehogs, these are all things that are kind of, I don't want to see gone.
Yeah.
So I think my natural instinct is don't change things.
Well,
I feel that all change is bad.
Yeah, I suppose what I'm saying to you is,
Which is oddly why I voted Remain in the EU referendum. Is that I felt it was the conservative thing to do. But let's not get into that.
We're not even going to talk
But it was
about
kind of, I don't really like change.
I consider you.
Whereas
to be,
you're a much more revolutionary figure. You're all for change.
No, I'm not. I'm a conservative. And by the way, I consider you to be my most Brexit-friendly Remainer
Well,
friend.
I'm agnostic now because I'm
suppose-
adjusting to the different.
I suppose if I'm going to make, and it's barely even a criticism, it's just an observation, is that I think that I'm prepared to go to meet you on the point of, look, we've got to change industrial agricultural practice, for example, so that we preserve more of our biodiversity and so on. I'm all for that. I'm all for sound land management, etc., etc. I just think that because you've got other priorities other than sort of winding people up and doing all the shit that I do, that sometimes, even though the truth is staring you in the face, badgers are the bloody problem. That you can't quite...
They are an expression of the problem.
Yeah.
Is that a kind of Weasley Guardian-y kind of thing to say?
Yes, it is. It is the most Weasley... may I say, it's the only Weasley
all I'm
Guardian.
saying is I'm not sharing your enthusiasm for launching a policy of genocide against badgers, which you're clearly itching to do.
We need Badgergeddon, and the reason that there is this aversion to Badgergeddon is that A, people have forgotten what first principles are. B, they fail to understand that there is no such thing as a sort of steady state environment.
No,
the
of course there
environment
is. James, I'm
managed.
not disputing that. I mean, but part of the problem is that we are now reduced to having to manage what is an ever kind of shrinking biosphere, and of course, the problem then becomes, well, which species are we going to? We have power of life and death over species. I mean, I accept that that's the problem.
We always have had.
But in a way, it would be better to try and work for an environment in which there can be a kind of measure of natural stability, in which badgers and hedgehogs can equally have enough space to live. But I mean, I know that's not going to happen. I accept your kind of, I kind of respect your unsparing, flinty-gazed willingness to stare into the kind of...
Can I just say,
the
let me tell you one thing.
Of the way that things are shit. I accept that things are shit, and that, one of the measures of the way that things are shit is that perhaps we've got to kill badgers to save hedgehogs.
I don't like often admitting that I have a warm, sensitive heart, really, because it seems to me characteristic of kind of liberal lefty virtue signalling. However, the other day, I was out walking the dog, and the dog ran off into the undergrowth, as it does, either to roll in fox shit or something stupid that dogs do, And it had something in its mouth, and it was running around triumphantly like, I've got something really cool, and you're not having it. And this thing was squealing, and I thought, oh my God, it's a baby rabbit. Please dispatch it quickly. And then as we got closer to the house, I realised it wasn't a baby rabbit. It was a baby badger. And when they're young, badgers are especially cute. Their white and black snouts are more defined. The markings are more defined. And of course, by the time, and I wish the badger had bitten it on the nose and taught it a lesson, because they have a very, very strong.
Or the dog had just killed it.
Strong jaws. The dog did kill it in the end, and I felt so.
But even rabbits, the population of rabbits is declining.
Not in my bloody garden.
No,
you should
but
see
nationally,
the havoc they wreak.
even rabbits are declining, and again and again, there's this kind of miserable sense that things that you just took absolutely for granted when you were a child are, it's like the Philip Larkin poem about the country. It's that's it. It's gone. The country
sparrows,
gone.
for example, sparrows, which were common as sparrows when we were young, are no longer. But then you get other species
Parrots.
which have increased. I think there are now too many red kites. But look, the point is this: that biodiversity is not some blessed thing that nature springs forth on its own. It happens in a managed landscape.
Certainly in Britain, yes.
In Britain it does. Yeah, exactly. Maybe it's different in the rainforest. I don't know, but yeah, in Britain it does.
Well, it takes us back to Stonehenge,
and we need to be grown up.
There are no aurochs left.
There we are. Should we end there? No more aurochs.
I think that's something we can agree on.
Lunch. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my special and multi-talented guest, the brilliant Tom Holland. Thank you and goodbye.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson.
I want to actually take a couple of the references to Donald Trump from hip-hop. And then we're going to try to see if we can figure out why they like Donald Trump. Jay-Z said, I'm at the Trump International. Ask for me. Raekwon said, I'm the black Trump. They are comparing themselves to what he represents. His wealth, his achievement, capitalism.
Sonny's Corner with Sonny Johnson. Saturday from 1 to 3 p.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.